Welcome to a very special episode of Cloudbusting. We're actually going to be running a series of trend episodes. So what do we see the trends coming up in cloud in 2021? Dan, Dave and I have put our heads together and we've come up with a number of trends that we're going to be releasing over a few weeks' time. And we're going to dive into each trend. We're going to try and get a guest on and talk specifically about that trend and just sort of get a bit of meat out of that. And the first trend we're going to be talking about is what we call the modernization era. And we're very excited to be joined by Brooks Borcherding. Brooks is the CEO of CloudReach. He's been on the show before, friend of the show. How are you doing, Brooks? Good to have you back.
I'm doing well, thank you. It's only been 50 episodes, Jez. I won't take that personally, so it's great to be here.
Well, the trouble is, if you have too much of a good thing, it's no longer a good thing. You've got to keep the audience waiting for you, Brooks. Keep them on tenterhooks. Dan and Dave are with us. How are you guys?
Well, I am very excited. Last time we had Brooks on the show, I learned so much about horse racing, more about horse racing than I've ever known before. So I wasn't expecting that. So here we are. I'm looking forward to see what analogies he pulls out the bag this time.
Just wait till my 10-second recommendation, Dan.
This is a high bar. Hey guys, how you doing?
Yeah, how are you, mate? You good?
Not too bad. You know, getting through early in the year, isn't it? It always feels like there's a long road in January.
Yeah, and I think it's probably worth just mentioning we're actually recording this in mid-January 21. Obviously, we're in a global pandemic. A lot of the trends are potentially being driven by the pandemic that's going out there. So we're trying not to time-bound it too much, but depending when you're listening to this, the world may have changed significantly, and obviously companies need to adapt to survive, and part of the trends that we're looking at is all around that. Let's start looking at this modernization era. I'm going to hand over to Dave. Dave's going to lead the conversation, and Dan and I will jump in. Dave, Brooks, over to you. Talk to us about modernization.
Thanks, mate. So, yeah, it's worth saying that a number of the trends we're going to talk about in these special episodes have been impacted by the pandemic. So I think setting our context out in terms of where we are in the pandemic at the moment is probably worth doing, so you can get a read on how we are seeing things. So as it stands right now, as Jez was saying, it is January 2021. We're coming up onto being in the pandemic state for about a year at this point. And to give you an insight into trends development, we started working on these trends probably in about Q3 of last year. So over the summer of last year is when we were beginning to start to see the types of impacts that we're going to talk about in Trends 21, and then what we think that's going to do to the market in 2021. The modernization era, this is a trend that talks about the different eras of cloud over about a 10-year period. It's something that we had in Trends 2020, but we've kept it here, one, because it provides some useful context about where transformation in the market is up to generally. But also, we think there's been an acceleration effect here as a result of COVID. So let me set out what the trend is, and then we'll start to pick it apart. So what we do is we talk about the fact that back in around the early noughties, is when we began to see the rise of cloud. And as it got towards the end of that decade, the emergence of IT-driven adoption of the cloud was beginning to start to become a very real reality for large-scale organizations. Before that, stuff was going on, but it was relatively small. But big-scale cloud migration starts around the 2010 mark. That early adoption was principally driven by IT departments. So this is some interested individuals in particular technology seeing the impact that it might have, and then making a decision to go after trying to implement it. In much of what IT does, that then resulted in a cost-centric business case. And that was like exiting a data center, avoiding an end-of-serviceable life event, something along those lines. The second era of cloud then, which came along quite shortly afterwards and then kind of runs in parallel for a good 5 or 8 years, is business-led experimentation. So this is around the edge of organizations with forward-thinking business leaders learning about new cloud services or software as a service, and implementing it locally and discreetly in their particular businesses. That might be a CMO coming up with a direct-to-consumer application, for example. And a pattern or a series of dots of those lighthouses began to become visible in multiple organizations. And sometimes, if they were very successful and drove new revenue, new customers, new services, etc., then it's quite likely that the emergence of a chief digital officer would happen around those lighthouses. And that pattern of CIO organizations driving cost-centric but very large-scale movement, and CDO offices driving revenue-based business cases, often very successfully, but not necessarily all joined up, and not necessarily all coordinated, and not necessarily all with the same purpose, became a prevalent pattern across large enterprises. What we think then is there will be a third era, which we're calling the large-scale modernization era, is where you join those factors together and you enable a board-level conversation to drive the whole thing with much more of a material purpose. And I think our position on this is that the pandemic has educated organizations in just how fast you can move if you move politics out of the way and you begin to start to drive technical change purely with business outcome in mind. And clearly, and what one will return to a lot during this series, clearly the big example of this is the epic jump most organizations have made in remote collaboration, and being able to see remote collaboration happen almost instantaneously for most companies overnight as a result of responding to the pandemic. So let's step away from that. Brooks, let's come to you. Let's start with the early days of cloud and cost-centric business cases. Does that resonate with you as where the cloud really began to manifest itself in organizations?
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. I mean, you articulated it extremely well. I like the phrasing of this with the generations and the decades, because it really was in 2010 when we started to see the early adoption of cloud in any meaningful way. But it was purely driven by the CIOs and trying to get from fixed infrastructure to agile infrastructure, trying to move their cost base from CapEx to OpEx, and trying to give themselves kind of that burstability and scalability from an infrastructure perspective that they didn't want to have to invest to peak loads, for their businesses. So that was purely it, and that drove the early adoption quite significantly. But it was still just first generation stuff, right? I was involved with deploying global infrastructure as a service offering, and you were really looking at just giving people self-service capabilities, controls over compute and storage and memory, and the ability to kind of build these on top of virtual environments and add some intelligence to it. And that did drive it. And then all of a sudden you saw the business innovation, the lighthouse applications, a lot of it being driven by SaaS and the availability that SaaS applications brought to the lines of business. And suddenly they didn't have to wait for the IT team to deploy the servers and make it available on the network. They could suddenly go to a SaaS company and to start to spin up their own services, right?
That was almost the start of shadow IT, right? You could almost call that era the shadow IT era as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because when these as businesses became more mature with those two models, I think it's exactly, Dave, what led to the tipping point of moving from. And you and I have bantered about the term digital transformation a lot.
Right.
Right. But I think generationally, it's enabled this digital transformation. But I think this generational change that we're seeing now is really around business transformation, right? So bringing all of this together and looking at more holistically in this next generation that we're looking for the next decade, and saying, okay, this is truly going to drive this era of modernization, which is being a link to true business transformation versus just, say, digital transformation.
Yeah, there's definitely something in that experimentation period of you can do interesting things, but if you're not fully integrated back into sort of the power of the main systems of record of the organization, you're perhaps not going to move the needle as much as you could potentially for the organization. I think the other big differentiator for me between era 2 and the modernization era is the sense of like of the purpose and pivot that the organization is intentionally going after. So the one that everybody harps on about, because I think it's a really good one, and it's actually very difficult to come up with a better one, is the Netflix pivot. Whenever that was now, probably 7 odd years ago. When
a long time ago,
yeah. And it's possibly true to say, though I'd happily be corrected to be wrong here, is that at enterprise level, moving from being a DVD distribution company to being a content provider, in fact, one of the biggest content providers in the world now, has got to be one of the most substantial pivots. And a lot of people at the moment, I think, are talking about Disney Plus in the same way. But Disney Plus is interesting because Disney Plus, for me, for example, it is a distribution pivot, but still from a content provider that's done a very good job of acquiring and aggregating other content providers to create a very powerful content platform. Do you draw a distinction between those two journeys, Brooks?
I think that it's a great reference. I of course, when this happened with Netflix, was the person believing that everybody's going to want to go to Blockbuster and keep getting their VHS tapes off the shelf. So that's so much from my insight and the insightfulness.
Investing heavily in Blockbuster.
Yeah, I thought two interesting things there. One, we're talking about Blockbuster. A lot of people are going who, and secondly, you said tapes. We're definitely aging ourselves there. My VHS or my Betamax tape that I had to get.
Yeah, but I do, Dave, think that's it's absolutely been the enabler of that type of true business innovation. And I was thinking about this related to the pandemic, actually, in the timing, right? Because a lot of this came together in a very kind of coincidental nature. The technology enablement, the business view of cloud, and what was now capable to do from this the acceleration of capturing this modernization era for the business transformation at the time of the pandemic. And so you think of that quote of necessity is the mother of innovation.
Right.
And suddenly, out of necessity, they were forced now to accelerate. And I think from IDC, and I'll let you speak to the IDC references here, but I think they're referencing 30% in the study of companies that they surveyed showed a meaningful acceleration in their cloud modernization, directly driven to the pandemic and the necessity for them to take that step.
Yeah. I think, it's hard to say at the moment, sitting at this end of 2021, just how profound the transformational impacts of the acceleration are going to be. I think we already know very clearly the transformational impacts on collaboration,
yes,
and distributed working, and what's highly likely, when people can travel again, to be a rise of digital nomadism and very different styles of working. I think is pretty much almost certain to happen at this stage. What I think is fascinating to start to think about then is if you're sitting leading an organization and all of a sudden you've seen your organization now not working in offices, which organizations are already consolidating their estate footprints and looking at their real estate costs. What do you do next? I mean, you're looking at potentially massively changing how you deliver services. What do you think? What do you think the sort of, you turn the dial up to 11? What do you think the big outcome could be here?
Well, I have no question that the big outcome is going to be the overall shift, investment shift from tools and products and services consumed in the workplace to tools and products and services consumed at home, as this will most certainly become more of a lasting, long-term working environment for all of us as we've suddenly adapted to this. And so you'll see a significant shift in, I think, just overall the capital invested in improving the home office and the concepts related to that. And I won't take credit for this. I give credit, Scott Galloway has been speaking about this quite a bit as far as one of his big themes as well. But that just goes to the fact of the reality of how we're adapting, driven by the pandemic, to this new work environment, and what the lasting effect it will have on us. Yeah, I'll take that back to this concept of generations, Dave. With 3 kids, we talk about what the definition of a generation is a lot, and a generation never really gets defined until you look back, right? So when you're in the point of change, Gen X held and became a defining generation. Gen Y got washed away by the millennials, and the millennials suddenly established themselves as a lasting generational trend. I think we have the same thing here to what becomes the definition of this generation. And when we look back at the pandemic and the impact and the changes to work and the changes to the way we consume technology and the way we change the way we consume entertainment, it'll be certainly a defining moment. It'll be interesting to look back 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and reflect on this point in time, and what we see then is a true generational change.
I think that's certainly going to be fascinating, and maybe we can already begin to start to see some of that wider shift enacting, right? So we talked a little bit about Netflix and Disney Plus, and of course, connected to that, there is whether cinema exhibition is going to make it through. And, on a personal level, like, goddamn, I hope it really does. But, that aspect of the industry is likely to undergo change. But also in a separate trend, we're going to talk about how what used to be luxury services digitally delivered are now becoming almost life-saving. And we're talking about things like home shopping and grocery deliveries that became a lifeline to communities and individuals during very harsh lockdowns. And Jez likes to often talk about being able to order beer much more straightforwardly, sitting at a table rather than standing at a bar. So I think, are we already beginning to start to see behavioral shift happening? We just don't really acknowledge it as such yet. And are businesses responding fast enough to that?
Yeah, I mean, we take for granted now. Amazon is a platform for a delivery of most goods to the home, and we've been a consumer of that for a long period of time. But just yesterday, I've got a new kind of network in the home, going back to investment in the home. That I set up, and realized at one point I need to have a simple gigabit switch, which I didn't have to have laying around because everything was wireless. But I'm distributing more of it wired to different parts of the home to drive higher performance. And just didn't even hesitate. Go to Amazon, get a $13 gigabit switch. It's delivered in a day, and without blinking. It's just a matter of course at this point to do that. And same thing with shopping for groceries. You just have a virtual cart, and the kids and everybody add on to that, and once a week we'll press go and get sent off, and then gets delivered. So. I mean, I think are just starting to adapt to these as a normal course of business without really pausing, and it's going to become routine for all of us. Is the way we work. Even on that, going back to your point around the collaboration, that's another good business example. We've all just kind of adopted to now connecting virtually. We drive video highly, as here at CloudReach, to try to make the experience more intimate. But with it being integrated into Slack and everybody being able to join and being able to be spontaneous and go through these different channels to make it as rich as possible without sitting in the same room together. Again, I think it's just become something that we've begun to adopt to and adapt to as part of that.
So bringing it together, then, I think for me the modernization era and the acceleration effect of the pandemic. So if we already had IT-driven and business experimentation-driven adoption, and that was trickling along, and we know that was trickling along at still quite a prestigious growth rate. So we were still up in the 30% on cloud growth rates. We also knew at some point that organizations were going to start to join those things up, but that was like a politically riven thing often. That the pandemic effect here is not only the need, e.g. the need to consume services differently, which drives an organization to respond, the need to work differently because we can't go, we can't commute, we can't travel, combined with the fact then they've got all of these works in progress, if you like. That's the modernization era that we can see. And so, Jez, I know you've been looking at the IDC report that we've been working on with them alongside creating the trends material. What does the market tell us about some of this stuff?
Yeah, well, firstly, let me just give a bit of context to the IDC report. So this was some research that we carried out in partnership with IDC, really focused on North America. But my guess is that what's going on in North America, it's a global pandemic we've got at the moment. The impact is global, so I think the results are going to be fairly similar. 200 CIOs were interviewed and asked questions around digital transformation and around the pandemic and the impact of that. And their approach to transformation, pre and post pandemic, and it's been launched. I think this can be downloaded from IDC or from Cloudreach's website, and it's an info brief. It's called "US Businesses Become Future Ready with Large Scale Cloud Migration." A nice, simple, snappy title there for you. Yeah. So a couple of interesting points that came from that. A lot of the enterprises were asked, how did the pandemic impact your digital transformation plans? 17% of respondents said that actually it's caused a massive delay to their digital transformation plans. But 30% said actually this is accelerated. And I think this is quite interesting that they obviously had a program in place. Something has come along, pandemic's hit, and that program has been squashed together. Time frames have been condensed massively. So I always question, all right, the pandemic was a catalyst and they were, it forced this change. I always wonder why couldn't they make that change quicker? Why does it need the pandemic to make that catalyst? 33.5% of organizations said that it had no impact on their digital transformation. 16% actually triggered the transformation, right? So they had no plans to do any transformation, and this caused it to do it. And 4% said no plans to transform. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting how that sort of pandemic hit, and interesting stats.
So I think organizations at this point now have they have consumed and really, really understand what's happening with their employees, and I think we're only just beginning to start to understand what's happening with services and their customers' expectations of them. So, Jez, I wonder, in the IDC survey, have we got any sense yet about maybe what they might, what organizations might think the big drivers are going to be for cloud and digital initiatives?
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting, right? Because I mean, if we look at cloud and cloud adoption, there's normally sort of four key drivers that are there. Just modernizing your overall infrastructure, cost benefit, time to market, and a sort of reduction of tech debt. There are some key, well-known general drivers for adopting cloud or going through that digital transformation. What was really interesting from the survey was actually the ones, the drivers that are normally mentioned and normally looked at are missing from the top two, right? The top two reasons for cloud, or where companies are seeing that they're going to get some of the biggest benefits from, and not the traditional ones. And I quite like this. I like the fact that almost that pivot's happened as well. The two that came up the top were very and quite far ahead of the others. So we had digital trust and security. So really that whole security play. And again, I'm thinking probably because there's a lot more remote working now, the sort of the borders of enterprises have now become a lot wider. So there's a whole huge play on digital trust and security. But really the one that really stood out for me, and I'm not sure this was really even thought about as a driver pre-pandemic, was that they want to give their employees a superior experience. So a superior employee experience was one of the top drivers for cloud. And I think that's really key. And if you'd asked pre-pandemic, we just didn't see it. We've done surveys, we've spoken to organizations. This was never really one of the drivers. But now you've got a whole workforce that's remote. We're working on screens all the time. It's a different mentality for your workers, and this sort of cloud adoption is giving that ability to offer a much better experience to the employee, and we're seeing it within Cloudreach as well. But yeah, really interesting that came out.
Yeah, Dave, let me just use that as a kind of step, because I think to bring us back to the first trend, which is I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, but this generational shift to modernization driving true business transformation. It represents that maturity now that we're seeing in the technology itself and the capabilities. So the business is now looking at this differently. To your point on maybe Netflix and what technology enabled them to do with their shift. But now businesses in general are really getting on board with, hey, let's reflect upon this to see how it can help us differentiate ourselves in the marketplace, bring services to market faster, change the experience for our employees, change the experience for our customers, change their supply chain and how they drive businesses. They're looking at this differently, which is really driving, I think, that alignment between the business-driven lighthouse opportunities that they were doing on innovation and the technology maturation of cloud coming together and saying, wow, what's possible now from a business transformation? I think super fortunate to have been working with you over the 16 months I've been here. You've taught me a lot about, from the work that you did in early stages of driving cloud adoption and the innovation through cloud for business transformation through work. You've talked about a lot of interesting things that companies typically don't necessarily think about when it's just a technology adoption, but now the business is involved as stakeholders they're considering. And I think it would be worth talking just about a couple of those, learnings as things that typically would not have been thought about, but now the business is thinking of.
And I think it's a great set of summary points to end on, which is as you move into modernization, what are the other factors that you need to consider? So maybe a thought from a couple of us. So thought from me probably on this is to think about the cloud ripple effect and think about how you need to understand the different aspects of what these little dots of cloud are going to do across your organization and how powerful it will be to join them up in a unified way. This is highly unlikely to be a technology conversation. This is much more likely, at the scale that we're going to be talking about here for some companies, much more likely to be a purpose of company conversation. So what actually, when you join these things up, are we trying to do? And I don't think now, and always I would probably have argued in the world of digital transformation, that should be where you start your conversation with anyway. But actually in standard business as usual, that feels like a bit of an awkward conversation, like, God, yeah, like a big boily ocean, start from first principles thing that a lot of, quite rightly, a lot of operational colleagues would have gone, we just haven't got time for that. We're too busy actually doing business. But I think in some cases now, the return to purpose, the leading from purpose, and then coordinating all of that activity, whether it be revenue-based business experimentation or large-scale IT change, and bringing all of that together to create an understood pivot, I think is the way to go with this. So my tip is start talking more broadly with colleagues. Brooks, what would your thought be?
Yeah, I've really grown to appreciate the need for governance structures around business transformation and how you peer together business owners and technology owners as part of that governance structure to make sure that we're aligned on that North Star and your purpose, and then backing into how we're aligning and agreeing to make progress along our journey toward that desired outcome.
Thanks, Brooks. Jez, why don't you bring us to a conclusion and add your thoughts?
Yeah, so look, great conversation, and I think I've lived all three of these eras and worked with customers at all different stages. Look, my advice, I think, for any organization or enterprise that's in either the IT or the shadow IT era, you have a conversation. You know? If you're CIO, go and talk to the business, right? Understand the business challenges, and let's do IT aligned to the business. And if you're in the business, stop treating IT as a pure utility. I think that's still, we see that in a lot of organizations. IT are not just the guys to send you a laptop and fix the printer. Work with them, align the business, embrace cloud, look at the transformation. There's a huge amount of benefits that can be drawn from this, but it does really require IT and the business to collaborate and be friends. So that takes us on to our TSR. So we have a little segment in the show called our 10-second recommendations. And I'm going to start with Dan, producer man. what is your TSR today?
My TSR today is a game. The game came out a few years ago now, but it's become pretty popular around the world during sort of lockdown times. A lot of sort of politicians and celebrities and whatnot have been playing it. But yeah, it's called Among Us. And I love it. So I've been playing it with some friends recently, and it's kind of like a sort of almost like a murder mystery thing. You play a group of people on a ship, a crew on a ship, and you have to do these little tasks. But there's an imposter among you, and it's the imposter's job to kill the passengers. And it's great fun. You just end up suspecting everybody. There's lots of accusations flying around, and it's a really good thing to play with a big group of friends.
Yeah. Do you like being the imposter or the crewmate?
You don't get a choice.
Yeah, which one do you prefer?
I like being the crewmate mainly because I'm just terrible at being the imposter. I have absolutely sort of no composure whatsoever when people are sort of accusing me. I end up just like losing it. So yeah, I think being a crewmate and just trying to survive is probably where I'm best at.
Brilliant.
Yeah, you're very sus. Yeah, very sus.
I will definitely concur with Dan's TSR there. Among Us is good fun. I've played it a lot with my kids. Love it. And only short games, right? It's not like you have to get really immersed in it.
They're exactly.
5 minutes a game. So brilliant. Dave, what do you have for us?
So I'm really late to the party on this one, but over the Christmas period, I watched all of Peaky Blinders. And I recognise I'm very late here, but it's a good show, Peaky Blinders. I don't know whether you've heard of it.
How's your Brummie accent going, Dave?
It's all right.
Right. Yeah.
I'm Peaky Blinder.
Oh God!
Good to see you, Blinders.
It's like natural, isn't it?
Seriously, Dave, you literally have only just caught up with that.
I had not seen a minute of it until just after Christmas. During that, like the hazy bit in between Christmas and New Year, and I'm like, Peaky Blinders, what's that?
I guarantee that Dave started having a Peaky Blinders wardrobe now.
Do you know that there is literally a website where you can buy their clothing called Shelby Clothing or something like that?
Yeah.
That's awful.
The merch side of this thing is absolutely massive.
Yeah.
And not only that, apparently getting Peaky Blinders tattoos is a thing.
No, I wouldn't do that.
So I've got a surprise for you, everyone. No, I'm kidding.
Dave, given that you've just heard of Peaky Blinders, I reckon the next show you should watch, there's a great show called The Sopranos. Maybe give that a watch.
Good one. What's it about? Brooks, what's yours? Get me out of this. What's yours?
It's funny because you both hit on two of our more popular new chat channels here in Slack. So we have Chat Binging now was the one that we created recently coming out of the holidays, and everybody started sharing their binge-worthy content for streaming. And sure enough, it's led to some really fun conversations
it's
and
good on that, yeah.
Interesting content to pick up. Yeah. So I picked up Ted Lasso out of that binging session, and it was great. And same for you, Dan. We've got the chat Among Us for you. So please join the group there and be sus. For me, I will start a new chat channel called Paddle Tennis for the group and see how many people join. So my TSR is something that, talking about the convergence of opportunity at the pandemic, paddle tennis is actually an outdoor sport typically played in the winter on a raised platform. Tennis rules, but it also has a screen fence around the outside, and you can play the ball off of the screen as well. It's a great sport because pretty much of any experience or talent, you can come out and play, run around in the cold weather and have fun. It's also been kind of increasing globally as far as interest goes. And what's interesting about the game is it appears pretty straightforward when you start to play. And you're just hitting the ball back and playing points, but it becomes very sophisticated when you get much more experienced. And when you watch the pros play, you recognize, this sport has a lot to it. But it gets me out during the pandemic. It's a pandemic safe sport.
Is it played with a smaller racket?
A smaller racket. They're typically they're hard. So the original ones were wooden, but now they're like solid wood. But now they're much different. It's a fairly solid bouncy ball
Right.
and it turns out the best way to win a point is to smack the ball and hit the other person on the other side. So it becomes a very good way to get your aggression out that gets from pent up from the pandemic and working in the confines of home. So would definitely encourage that for anybody that has access to to those type of facilities.
It's a good one. I don't think I've ever seen a paddle tennis court in real life.
Yeah, and you'll like it, Dave. It typically involves a beverage of choice. Typically, so
that's something I can get on board with.
Excellent.
Jez, what's yours? Bring us home.
So I'm going to recommend an app called Turf, and this gets you outside as well. So this is an app. I think it came out of Norway or Sweden. But essentially what you do is you walk around your local area and there are little GPS. So in the app, it has a map and there are little areas that are marked on the map. And if you go and stand within the coordinates, you own that piece of turf. And nobody can then own it for 15 minutes. And you build up turf, right? And there's thousands of, probably hundreds of thousands of these turf spots that you can own. And basically, whilst you own turf, you're scoring points. So the more turf you own, the more points you get. And there's all these leaderboards, and there's a local leaderboard, and then a Greater London, and then a global one. And it's fantastic. It's so simple. It's really easy to use. Great. Gets you out. It actually turns a walk or getting out of the house, which can be a bit monotonous, into a bit of an interesting trip. So yeah, highly recommend it. Turf.
I don't know where to start with that.
It sounds like competitive existing.
You would not believe how competitive it is. So my girlfriend is doing it. She's fourth in Greater London, and there's four of them that are literally out there for hours collecting turf, and you can see them on the map going around tracking, and it gets really competitive. So somebody will own some turf, and then somebody will go and steal it off them, and then they'll steal it back, and great.
I was going to make a joke as you were going into this, like, ha, 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 is it about turf, grass? Are you interested? And like, lo and behold, what you came up with is actually duller than an app about actual turf.
So boring.
It's not. Get out there. I mean, for you sofa Luddites just lying there, I get it. It's probably a bit too much for you. You stick to Among Us. But for us, paddle tennis, going out, exercising, go get them, mentally strong people. Brilliant. Great set of TSRs. Thanks, everyone. A really good show. We are bringing out 5 more of these trend shows, so please watch out for them. We'll be doing them over the following weeks. Brooks, thanks ever so much for coming on. Really good to have you back on the show.
My pleasure.
Dave, Dan, lovely to have you back. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Jeff.
We're on LinkedIn. We are also on Twitter at Cloudbusting Pod. Please do feel free to contact us and talk to you next time. Bye-bye.